philosophy, appropriately because it is a philosophy in schools, is incompatible with what we want. Now let me begin with, at an earlier stage, by returning to an earlier question that I asked in the course, which is the position of our exploration in relation to the major traditions of world philosophy. And my proposal is that there are two major traditions of world philosophy. Let me call the first the Greek philosophy of being, or the philosophy of deep structure. And the second, the philosophy of the timeless one, also known in the history of philosophy as speculative monism. And let me begin then by a word about these two philosophical traditions. The first tradition is the tradition that is the major influence in the history of Western philosophy from Plato and Aristotle to today, through the major traditions of fundamental science, of physics, in the 20th century in 20th century science. This science is regarded as fundamental because it is the science that studies the world from the standpoint of two entities or two ideas. The first idea is that...
Sorry, I think your mic is not on.
You don't hear me, okay? Turn it on. Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first tradition is the tradition that I'm going to call the tradition of the Greek philosophy of being, the philosophy of deep structure. The idea is that there are two basic subject matters of philosophy. One is the basic structure of nature, the basic constituents of nature, as described, for example, by the standard model of particle physics in contemporary science. And the second subject of fundamental science, according to this tradition, are the laws, constants, and symmetries that govern this basic structure. A fundamental premise of this tradition, all the way from the ancient Greeks to 20th century science, is that what is most basic about nature is exempt from time. What is most real is what is least time-bound. So time exists, and most of natural phenomena are within time, but the basic structure and the fundamental regularities governing this structure are outside of time. What is most real is least temporal. Now, Michael, would you like to comment on this proposition?
I will simply say, note the degree to which we tend to take this completely for granted. So in the sciences, as Roberto has mentioned, this is taken completely for granted, right? There is a structure to the universe. That universe consists of particles arranged in different ways. We understand that by understanding the laws that govern them. We completely take this for granted. And I would simply point out, we take it for granted not because empirically it is undeniably true. Obviously, by making that view, it has been very productive for all aspects of sciences. However, it doesn't follow that it's true. Not at all. In fact, there are many contemporary physicists strongly disagree with that position. So the degree to which we take that for granted is a very, very dangerous fact. And we'll be exploring later this semester very different views that will have extremely different understandings of the world, of temporality, of even visions of reality that will result in radically different understandings of everything, including obviously the concerns of discourse, the conduct of life. So it is important to note this is an idea that arose at a certain time, has become dominant, and therefore should be
It has remained
rejected.
dominant.
Completely dominant, completely dominant, to the point where it's not seen as a theory.
Now, there is a contingent feature of the history of modern science that bears very directly on this problem. In the 1920s, with Lemaitre and others, we discovered that the universe has a history. That the universe is historical. And that if the universe has a history, then everything within nature must be historical. But it happens that the fundamental themes or approaches of 20th century science, relativity and quantum mechanics, developed before the historical character of the universe was established. So there's an anomaly then. The teaching of, the empirical teaching of modern cosmology is that everything in the universe is historical, but the tendencies of 20th century physics teach that what is basic in nature is not historical. This is a flat-out contradiction in the history of contemporary science. The contradiction is managed in the history of science by treating cosmology, the science or theory of the universe, as if it were a kind of exception. Cosmology is treated as if it were a large-scale astronomy rather than the major science of physics. Literally, if you have a science of the universe, everything in the universe should be subject to the approach of that science. You see the contradiction? Does everyone understand why that is a contradiction? You want to comment, Michael?
That sounds perfect.
Now, this has particular interest to us in the study of orientations to existence, because for the Semitic monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, time is an essential medium. God's plan, God's interaction with humanity is developed in time. The plan of redemption, which if it's executed or not, must occur in time, and time is essential. But that's not the lesson of modern science, and thus the contradiction pursues us into the study of religion. Now, one of the devices by which this dominant tradition in modern science is reconciled with the discovery of the historical character of natural reality is by what in effect are a series of accommodations that are also fallacies. Let me call one the Newtonian paradigm. The Newtonian paradigm, which has prevailed in modern physics from the time of Galileo and Newton to today, is that the explanation of nature goes like this. We investigate nature piece by piece. It's like a flashlight exploring every corner of nature. We establish always a configuration space that is limited on one side by boundary conditions that we stipulate. The boundary conditions, there are laws governing the phenomena, and we go from one part of nature to another. What from a standpoint of one instance of this method is the explanandum, to explain, from another becomes the boundary conditions, and little by little we shift what is explained and what is presupposed until finally we've exhausted all of the subject of study. The consequence is that the general character of nature explains us, because this paradigm, this method of explanation, cannot be generalized to the whole of science or to the whole of nature. It's only for dealing with the parts of nature piecemeal, part by part. Now, there's also a fallacy, not of the part by part, but of the temporal evolution of the universe. We now know enough of the history of the universe to infer that there was a time in the history of the present universe when the basic structure of the universe could not have been what it is now, when the elementary constituents of nature described by the model of particle physics did not hold. And there was a time when we now describe as the laws of nature or its symmetries and constants did not exist. That's just an implication of the historical character of the universe. So on that view, once again, the basic structure of nature is outside. Is outside of nature, is outside of time. So time does not go all the way down. The fundamental structure of the world is exempt from time. Now let's say that's the first major world tradition of philosophy. It has been predominant in the history of the West, but in the history of ancient India, of ancient Indian philosophy, for example, it has been the dissident tradition. The second major tradition has been what has been sometimes called speculative monism, or the philosophy of the timeless one. It says that change and distinction are epiphenomenal. They don't go all the way down. That the distinctions among phenomena or the changes among phenomena are either unreal, illusory, or they are superficial. They don't go to rock bottom. And this is a view that has been predominant in ancient India, but that is a dissonant view in the philosophy of the West. There were philosophers who adopted this view, especially Schopenhauer, and to a lesser extent, Spinoza and Leibniz. So there we are, in a contradiction that places some of the orientations to existence that we will be exploring at odds with the dominant view in the history of the West and with the dominant view worldwide, because the other tradition, the tradition of speculative monism, also associates reality with atemporality. What is common to these two major traditions of world philosophy? What is common is precisely the recognition of the universal and fundamental character of time. Time is not completely for real for either of the traditions. Now, there is a third view that one could have. And the third view might seem to be the most plausible and the most appealing. The third view is that everything that exists changes. Everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. So the distinctions among things are mutable, and with the renewal or transformation of kinds of things in natural reality, the way in which they change also changes. So, for example, the so-called laws of Mendelian genetics presumably did not exist before the life phenomena which they govern. They co-evolved with the phenomena themselves. So what's the third view? The third view in the global history of philosophy is that everything that exists changes sooner or later and is no less real on that account. A phenomenon does not become less real simply because it is transitory. Because everything in the universe is transitory. That's a third position. Now, this third position is not completely without representatives in the history of the West. It goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics, to Heraclitus, and then to Plotinus, and in modern philosophy, to Hegel, and to a lesser extent, to Leibniz and Spinoza. That's the third position. The third position could be described as a temporal naturalism. It is temporalism because it says, what it says is that the most fundamental aspect of reality is its temporal character. What is time? Time is the feature of reality by virtue of which it is susceptible to change. And another seemingly paradoxical way of defining what time is, a task which St. Augustine claimed to be impossible, is to say, time is the transformation of transformation. That's what time is. But this position, which would seem to be the most plausible, and which is certainly the one that is easiest to reconcile with the Semitic monotheisms, speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. The philosophers that have represented it have not represented it radically. They've only represented it with provisos, like Hegel, Leibniz, and Spinoza. And to the extent they have represented it, they represent an exception or a deviation in the history of philosophy. Now, what about that?
Sure. Let me just add in a very quick footnote. We won't be getting to this until later this semester, but The one aspect of world philosophy that does pick up on this third position is actually the early Chinese tradition that we'll be looking at. Now, one of the reasons it's so intriguingly the fact that we don't think of it as such is that we will see when we get to it, the entire early Confucian tradition comes to be reread in terms of something called Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism does pick up on a bit of this. However, they are absolutely committed to the position that the world is fundamentally coherent. There's a coherence out there that we are trying to understand and live properly within. And needless to say, once you're committed to a vision of coherence, any strong argument that absolutely everything is always temporally changing gets pushed to the side, to put it mildly. So when we get to that discussion toward the end of the semester, we will be, for this reason, largely looking at that early period, looking at how and why that was pushed aside, and then asking what would happen if we would take it seriously and then reconstruct it for the modern times. So just a brief footnote of points to come later.
So this temporal naturalism is a deviation. But if the religions of the Bible, the Semitic monotheisms, are to be taken at their word, they do seem to presuppose that time is not epiphenomenal or illusory, but it is the essential medium of reality. And this is then a problem or a puzzle for our exploration throughout. Now, as I suggested in the first class, in all the major traditions of philosophy, and in particular in the two that I claim to be the dominant traditions, philosophy has been cast as a super science, standing above the particular disciplines and holding the key to reality. And all the philosophers, all the great philosophers in the history of certainly Western philosophy, have claimed to reveal the essential nature of reality. Although they had been of two minds in making this claim. For example, Spinoza said in the preface to his masterwork, The Will as Representation, the world is will and representation. My philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence. But later on, in another essay, Schopenhauer said, a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. And these two propositions cannot be both true, right? Unless we hold that there's one particular temperament that holds the key to reality. So the philosophers have been ambivalent in this claim that they reveal the secrets of reality, the ultimate enigma of the world. Now we come to the dominant tradition of moral philosophy. But before that, let me say something else. This view of philosophy as a super science says the super science has a practical aim. It's not just an elucidation of reality. The super science is in the service of self-help. And what is the self-help against? The self-help is against the incurable flaws in the human condition. The ones we discussed in the first class, our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. The super science is to help deal with that. So a super science in the service of this self-help is what philosophy has generally been in the West. Now, this is not the only conception of philosophy. Recently, another conception of philosophy has arisen, and sometimes labeled analytical philosophy. It's a professional philosophy pursued in the academy. And one might describe it as a kind of thought police. The aim of this thought police is to establish how you can or should argue. So it's a shrunken conception of philosophy. Shrinks. And it turns out that the thought police is sort of unemployed because no one is very interested in consulting this thought police or takes it very seriously. So it's a reduction of philosophy to a superfluous enterprise. But there is one domain in which the shrunken conception of philosophy has prevailed, and that's moral philosophy. What we'll next come to. And here let me put squarely the contrast to the religions of the Bible, to the Semitic monotheisms. And let me describe the teaching of this moral philosophy in a series of propositions. The first proposition is that the basic problem of the moral life is our self-centeredness or our self-interest. And therefore the task is to overcome it. So the moral philosophers, according to this view, the contemporary modern philosophers, faced with the command of the prophet or the Redeemer, Christ, to love the stranger, assume that it's impossible to execute it. We cannot love the stranger. And they offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal benevolence. That's the basic perspective of modern moral philosophy, as described by the contemporary analytical philosophers, or its projection into moral philosophy. So, if the first proposition is that the basic problem is self-centeredness or self-interest, the second proposition is that our attitude or our approach should be an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. That's the essence of morality, according to these moral philosophers. And it's squarely put in the contrast between Christian love and universal or altruistic benevolence. Love is not benevolence. Christianity is the religion of the love. and the religion of the infinite. What's the difference between altruism and love? First, for altruism, the problem is self-interest and taming it. For love, the problem is reciprocal recognition and acceptance. How can we become free through connection with the other in such a way that our connection, rather than subjugating us or diminishing us, enhances our sentiment of being, makes us freer? It's a different problem from the problem of altruism. In altruism, there's no epistemic hurdle. We don't have to imagine the other, who is the beneficiary of our generosity. We sacrifice for the sake of the other, but we don't require to grasp the other, to imagine the other. In love, there is an epistemic or imaginative threshold. The initial problem in love is to be able to imagine the other before we do good for him. Then, in altruism, the altruist may have to sacrifice for the beneficiary. But he doesn't have to be equal to the beneficiary. The altruist can look from on top or from a distance at the beneficiary of his altruism. Love requires some kind of fundamental equality, not in any simple objective sense, but it's this demand for a fundamental connection, mutual recognition and acceptance. And finally, in altruism, although it may require extreme sacrifice, and even the sacrifice of one's life by the altruism, it imposes no inner jeopardy. Whereas love has as its price the heightening of vulnerability. And it does impose this inner jeopardy. And this already is a puzzle in the interpretation of Christianity, for example. Because after all, most of the conventional accounts of the ethic recommended by Christianity come under the label of charity. And charity is a form of altruism, if it's not love. So right there we have a question. Is Christianity the religion of altruism, or is Christianity the religion of love? And I'm claiming that these are fundamentally different. So then the second proposition is that we should deal with the problem of self-centeredness or self-interest. Either by altruism on one interpretation or by love on another. The third proposition is that the task of morality is to define our obligations to other people. So at the extreme, life is like a book of accounts where you have your assets and your liabilities indicated. And the aim is to reach the end of your life, the end of your days, with all your debts paid and your account settled. To be blameless, guiltless, with your hands as clean as were the hands of Pontius Pilate after he washed them. This is the account that the moral philosophers give of the essence of morality. Their ethic is like the ethic of surgeons: do no harm. Now we come to the fourth proposition, which is that this method, this attitude, must be expressed in a method, which is the philosophic calculus, utilitarianism, or the categorical imperative, whatever can be universalized as a maximum of conduct, or the idealized situation of choice, the social contract. And for each method, there are little quirks, little differences in the working out of the method. So, for example, for the philosophic calculus, utilitarianism, an initial question is, what is the criterion of the greatest happiness of the greatest number? Is it the view that the agent has of his happiness? Or is it the view of the philosopher who is determining who owes what to whom? If it's the view of the person who's manipulating the method, then he's the dictator, he's the moral tyrant. But if it's the view of the agent himself, it's completely different. Now we can formulate the same problem in the language of the categorical imperative. And what's the problem? The problem is the impossibility of inferring content from form. It doesn't seem that by simply requiring that the maxim be universalizable, we can define its content. It's not enough. One of the famous works of 20th century ethics by the German philosopher Max Scheler took as its topic the impossibility of deducing content from form in this Kantian moral philosophy. And in the social contract we say, it's not as if there were a real constitutional convention to determine the arrangements of society, but there's an idealized situation of choice which requires us behind the veil of ignorance to choose the principles that would apply to us, as in the contemporary Rawlsian moral and political philosophy. And that then is the fourth proposition. The fifth proposition is that because of the ambiguities or indeterminacies of this apparatus, the method that we've chosen, the philosophic calculus, the categorical imperative or the social contract, has to have an institutional instrument. The method has to be identified with an institutional arrangement. So it won't be the philosopher who chooses how the method is applied. It'll be this institutional arrangement. And the two main candidates for this institutional arrangement are the democracy and the market. Now, what then becomes the problem? The problem becomes that every particular version of either the market or the democracy is contestable. There's no incontestable version of one of these collective methods. And that's the subject of history. History is all this fighting that occurs ideologically or practically about which form of one or the other is to prevail. So what becomes of this? Now let me make another comment about these philosophies. You know that these three methods that I've described, the utilitarian, Bentham consequentialism, the Kantian, the categorical imperative Kant, or the social contract, Rousseau, now the contemporary moral theorists like Rawls. These methods are all versions of the same project. So their representatives claim them to converge. So Derek Parfit, a philosopher, we have him in the readings, says they're all equivalent, really. And everything that we say in one vocabulary can be translated into the other. There are different ways of ascending the same mountain from different sides. And that they are equivalent is an indication that they must be true or they must be valid. Now, of course, this is a piece of intellectual provincialism. These are moral ideas common among these analytical philosophers, the exponents of the thought police in a little part of the world. How do we get from there to the universal moral opinions of humanity? This is the provincialism, right? The alternative view is they are equivalent only because they're all empty. And the three versions of the philosophic calculus, the categorical imperative, and the social contract can be manipulated to produce the same result. Any lawyer would know how to do that. So we could say the whole operation is a kind of legalistic moralism or moralistic legalism, which the philosopher stands in the front rows of the temple, raises his eyes to his deity, the fantastical embodiment of his moral severity. It says, am I not pure? Am I not blameless? Have I not paid all of my debts and followed the rules and paid out my obligations to the others? And from the standpoint of a religion like Christianity, you could say that such a person is a monster and not the embodiment of any kind of moral perfection, but the embodiment of a perversion. Well, let me stop there for the moment. Michael, ask for your comments.
Yes. So thank you. Let me indeed just say a few words that will be little more than footnotes to Roberto's brilliant comments. So I'll begin with Parfit itself and then sort of work from Parfit to the larger arguments that Roberto is laying out for us. So to begin with Parfit, as Roberto has mentioned, Parfit is, or was, he passed away recently, a leading scholar of analytic philosophy, particularly focusing on moral philosophy. And as Roberto has mentioned, he sees as his philosophical project bringing together the, as he would think, only three positions that explain how one should act morally. As Roberto has said, these are the categorical imperative developed by Kant, utilitarianism, and social contract theory. The first, as Roberto has mentioned, again, just a quick footnote to be sure we're on the same page. The categorical imperative, of course, was developed by Kant, the quick version of which is, I should never act in any way that I could not make into a universalizable law. So the famous example that Derek Parfit plays a lot on is the murder, the innocent man and the murderer example. So when Kant lays out this argument, he gets a critic who says, okay, let's imagine a scenario where an innocent person knocks on your door and you open the door and the innocent person says, well, I'm innocent and there's this evil murderer who's gonna kill me, can I hide in your house? And you say, okay, of course you can hide in my house. And then the murderer knocks on the door and says, oh, hi, I'm an evil murderer, and there's an innocent person I'm trying to kill for no reason. Is he hiding in your house? Now, can you lie? And the critic of Kant was saying, well, of course, you lie. Well, Kant's response was, well, no, you cannot make into a universalizable law that we would lie, and so you have to tell the truth that, yes, the innocent man is hiding in my back bedroom, but the hope is that while you're telling the truth, he'll sneak out the back door and actually survive. Now, obviously, Kant is not a fool, as we'll see momentarily. Kant is a very brilliant figure with a very significant project. But the reason he's taking that seemingly absurd position is he wants to say, look, you absolutely cannot take into account consequences in your decision making, because as soon as you do, it will get you down this rabbit hole where you can basically justify anything. So in that example, there's an innocent person, there's an evil murderer. Kant's point is, that's never going to happen in real life. It's never going to be that clear cut. And so you can't deal with consequences. You must simply deal with the world in terms of making universalizable laws.
So the claim is that each of these methods to work, to be sufficiently determinate to produce a particular result in a particular circumstance, requires there to be assumptions or boundary conditions that will make it determinate. For example, the veil of ignorance, the idealized situation of choice. You say, you'll only get it to work if you define it so that, in fact, the conclusion will already be hidden in the premise. You won't be able to say, you as an individual will belong to this or that social class, but you will be able to give enough detail so they can yield a particular conclusion. So you won't be able to get anything out of the categorical imperative, out of the philosophic calculus, or out of the veil of ignorance that you didn't put into it in the first place. That's the problem. That's the analytic or methodological problem. But the substantive problem is that the whole perspective of the moralistic legalism is questionable to start with, rather than this analytic quibble that I've just described.
So to underline precisely that point, the degree to which, as we will see, Parfit is indeed, it's not just Parfit, the entire body of thinking he's coming out of, are doing exactly this. So, utilitarianism, again, is arguing on the contrary, it's all about consequences. So, everything is about weighing consequences, and as Roberto has mentioned, you can either have act utilitarianism, which, just to be sure,
Saying the
perfectly, yes.
consequences
So-
apply decision by decision.
Exactly.
Where rule utilitarianism, the consequences apply rule by rule. And that, of course, is the practical one.
Yes.
That's the route that is followed. Now, don't think that these philosophers who were named actually thought this stuff, because each of them had a view of the road to our ascent to a higher form of being. They're not responsible for this methodological formula. Let me give you an example. Bentham, characterized as the heartless representative of the philosophical calculus, wrote in a dedication to a lady in London society the following: "The best way to be happy is to make other people happy. The best way to make other people happy is to pretend to love them. And the best way to pretend to love them is to love them in fact." And in this way, in just 2 moves, he went the whole distance from Bentham to Christ. And that's what happens in the actual application and development of these philosophies by the philosophers, whom therefore we shouldn't blame for this contraption.
Great, so to quickly get to the third before we move to the larger picture, which I think is indeed the key here. So, with the big focus that Parfit will make with utilitarianism is, again, rule utilitarianism. So how do I develop rules that will allow me to understand the proper way to weigh these consequences? In other words, is it a greater benefit for X number of people versus lesser benefit for more people? And so you have rules that will lay out what those consequences are. And the third one, of course, going quickly, is social contract theory, which would say the right thing to do is what rational people would agree in an ideal speech situation is the proper thing to do. And all of these latter ones involve attempts to create these moments. So the ideal speech situation is the way Habermas puts it. When these were originally developed, the argument was the state of nature, but all of these serve the same purpose, which is to say, take out all of the complexities of the world, take out all of the questions of who you are in the historical context in which you're living, and simply imagine a world of rational individuals debating amongst themselves what the proper way to act would be. Now, as Roberto has mentioned, Parfit's move here is to say these seemingly radically incompatible positions are in fact 3 different positions climbing up the exact same mountain, and if you can show that they are all in fact saying the same thing, you can move to the top of the mountain, you will have answered all of the questions of moral philosophy, and you will have therefore reached what, this is of course the title of his book, a proper understanding of what really matters. Now, as Roberto has said, and I will strongly agree, the counter way of reading that entire move would be to say you can make all of these 3 come together because they all share the exact same sets of assumptions about how to articulate a moral problem, how to adjudicate a moral problem, and the reason he can write this 3-volume work is because all it takes is this incredibly detailed maneuvering to basically show that they're all saying the same thing. And it takes 3 volumes, but the quick version of this is basically to say, okay, well, with Kantian deontological ethics, yes, you must act as a figure who is only acting according to universalizing laws, but those universalizing laws are how a rational agent would act in a specific situation. So, as Parfit himself talks about in terms of the murder innocent person example, of course you lie in that example because you're not universalizing lying, you're simply universalizing lying in that specific situation. So that's how he brings in consequences. Then he will say, okay, but how do you weigh those different consequences when it's not something so simple as evil, murder, innocent person? And then, of course, you have to adjudicate how you actually work out the consequences, which he will argue requires a social contractarian theory. And then over the course of 3 volumes, he basically says each of these 3 positions seemingly, he claims, incompatible. If you twist them enough and bring them to what he would call the most powerful form, they all say the same thing. As Roberto has said, perhaps the argument should go the exact opposite way, which is that Parfit, very much against his wishes, has shown the degree to which all 3 of these share the exact same set of assumptions, and perhaps this is a really good argument as to why we should question those assumptions. And let me just underline Roberto's points by doing so. Let's begin, or sort of go back to, perhaps the better verb here, to Roberto's larger point. Where do these ideas come from that this period of moral philosophy that Parfit kind of represents is pulling from? It all comes from a certain time and a certain place, basically late 17th through mid-19th centuries in Europe exclusively.
The early modern period.
Early modern period, exactly. So very, very provincial, and this is not, needless to say, a random moment in history. The thinkers who are developing these arguments are not, despite what you might have thought reading the Parfit readings, non-great thinkers. These are thinkers who are trying to rethink the world, and in ways I think we'll want to be very critical of, but let's give them their due first, because it is much more dramatic than the way you would get a portrait of from a text like Parfit's. So, first of all, and I'm going to reverse the order now, moving chronologically, social contract theory emerges, of course, in the 17th century. It emerges with people, as Roberto has mentioned, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and it continues through recent theorists like Rawls, Habermas, etc. The basic move here is to say, and here it's very much a state of nature argument, we all live in a world that, of course, is dominated by aristocratic clans. States, to the degree to which they exist, are largely simply the most powerful aristocratic clan. However, there is the beginning of a market going on. And these are theorists who want to take that and run with it. The move, in essence, is to say, what if we take basic Christian visions, and we'll here focus on 2 of them that we'll then be returning to next week and trying to rethink, but beginning with the Christian idea of a dialectic between human and divine power, in which you have a divinity who is a legislative divinity who controls the world, creates and controls the world, and you have this vision also coming from Christianity of radical love. And the move of these early modern thinkers is to, on point 1, give a secularized, naturalized version. That's sort of jumping a bit of time. In their vision, it would be a Protestant, secularized Protestant rereading. But the key for that in terms of our concerns is you say every single individual should be thought of as, in a sense, as a mini-god, a figure who controls X amount of things, his world, and that world should be considered his property. And he is a rational agent in control of that property. And the reason you put it in the state of nature argument is you are taking out the world they were living in and saying, let's imagine you're in a state of nature. These possessive individuals all have their own resources. What will they do? Well, of course, they will kill each other as they battle over these resources. So, what on the contrary we should do is ask, how would they choose to work together to decide what it is they will not be willing to give up, in other words, what is their property, versus what it is they are willing to sacrifice for a larger peace. And for all of the differences between a Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, we'll give very different answers to this, but all are trying to say it is an agreement among rational, possessive individuals to accept some limitations on their personal autonomy in order to create a world of peace.
So
please.
So there are 3 ways of interpreting the phenomenon that Parfit is describing, which is the apparent convergence of these 3 moral theories in the same direction. The first way is to say, is his way, is to say, they're all converging, that must show that they're true. Their convergence creates a presumption of validity. The second way is to say, they all appear to converge because they're basically empty. They're manipulable. So they each have a method which produces something so long as you put something into it. There has to be the boundary condition, the stipulation, determinate enough to produce the result, and then it will produce the result. But it was there because you put it into it. The third way, which I think is more interesting for us, given our objectives, is that this is an expression of a particular world, a particular culture, a particular kind of society. And the apparent convergence is the result of that similarity. And what are the elements of this convergence? First, a particular kind of market order in which there is the crucial elements are the classic property right. The property right unites all the component faculties of property and vests them in the same right holder, the owner. It establishes a crystalline boundary between the area of the right, the entitlement, in which the owner has absolute prerogative, and any step outside that area in which he has no prerogative. The classical contract, the fully articulated bilateral executory bargain. At arm's length, fully bargained out and exhausted in a particular moment, instantaneous bargain. Those are the legal elements, that is, of that order. So it's the order of this petty bourgeois world. In the United States, where in the 1830s, only 1 out of 5 men in the North worked for another white man. So it's this world of this petty bourgeois artisan economy, this property-owning democracy of small-scale property governed by the classical rules of property and contract, which were themselves inventions of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Then the second element is a proto-democratic liberalism, like the American Constitution, the kind of polity set up by the American Constitution. A low level of popular mobilization, of popular engagement in political life, this rigid constitutional structure requiring you to choose between Madison and Mussolini, and this world of limited democracy, cold democracy, based on the assumption that there's an antithesis between mobilization and institutionalization. A democratic polity is either cold and institutional, like Madison's scheme, or is it hot and anti-institutional, like Mussolini? It can't be both hot and institutional. And the third element is the privatization of the sublime in religion. The religion, like 18th and 19th century Protestantism, of the inner sublime, in which the individual doesn't just interact with God. In a very real sense, the individual is God. He is a little God, a part of God. And this world, that is the world on the basis of which there is this moral convergence of the three methods, is that world. That's the thesis. Its application to our world is then an abuse, an extravagance, the consequences of which we'll be discussing further.
Let me just add again another quick footnote. So, exactly. So this is the world of early modern Europe. We mentioned the degree to social contract theory arises in that context, going very, very quickly, now chronologically, not the way Parfit will organize it. The next, of course, is Kant, chronologically. Kant's entire argument, I mean, the little snippet you get from Parfit is just, it hardly gives you a sense. So Kant's basic vision in a nutshell is to try to say, what if the entire world were to be understood as these little gods? So every individual should normatively be a self-legislating agent, exactly like God is a self-legislating agent. And how would these self-legislating agents act properly? They would again act according to universalizable laws, and this is part of a much larger project which works out what it would mean by implication to rethink metaphysics, to rethink ethics, to rethink aesthetics, if we understood that this is a human attempt to understand the world and organize the world, as opposed to following divine visions or trying to understand some kind of divinity. So it is a radicalization of the position we just mentioned. And moving to utilitarianism, this of course develops in the 19th century, as Roberto mentioned with Bentham. Bentham's move here, of course, is coming later. This is after you're getting a very significant market economy, to put it mildly, developing in Europe, and you're getting very significant states based to a significant degree to create those markets, to undercut aristocratic power, to create these markets. And Bentham's big move is to say, social contract theory and Kantianism are inadequate because what we need are experts who can work out the large-scale operations of states and utilities. So how do you work out how much taxes you should be taking from people? How do you work out large-scale state policies, which are all about taking things from certain individuals for the greater good? And the key is, how do you work out the rule-based system for this? How do you build a prison system that would be run by the state, that would give benefits by reducing crime, the claim was, but do so without the kinds of torture that had been common or was even common in his own day. So it's all this attempt to work out rule utilitarianism in a grand state, well, a grand system in which you have states trying to organize these self-legislating individuals according to things that would go beyond a democratic process, as in a social contract theory, and go beyond universalizable self-legislating agents. So note immediately, all three of these positions, and we'll come back to critiques of them, but note how radical these positions are. These are positions to radically rethink the world based upon a strong rereading of Christianity, in which individuals become the little gods, and in which universal love becomes, exactly as Roberto has said, all about the proper ways that we should interact with other self-legislating, possessive individuals. And so when you get this attempt in recent moral philosophy that we're giving Parfit as a perfect representative of, note how, number one, distilled these grand arguments are into, as Roberto has said, really procedural arguments. But note too, and directly related, how these arguments work, because they're very telling. So the ways these arguments work, and if you flip through the 3 volumes, you'll see this over and over again. The way these work is you will create these things that we mentioned last week, these very artificial situations. Say, the standard example I mentioned last week, you're on a lifeboat because your ship is sunk, there's 4 of you, there's enough food for 3 people.
So what we call moral casuistry.
Exactly. And then it's this endless discussion of, well, of course, from a Kantian deontological position, you can't throw someone overboard, so you have to just hope a ship will save you as you all 4 eat the food for the 3 people. From a utilitarian perspective, of course, you throw someone over because the greater benefit is 3 people surviving. But the problem is, who do you throw over? And then, of course, the social contractarian theory is, well, how do you debate as to who you throw over? Well, I should show. On the utilitarian argument, the argument would be, what is the rule by which you would decide who gets thrown over? Is it going to be based upon age? So the younger person should, of course, be the one to survive because they haven't lived as long a life. Do you base it on position? Well, here's the president of a major country, so we don't want to throw that person over. So is it age, is it rank, is it position? All of that would be utilitarian. The social contract theory, of course, would be, well, the four people should, as rational agents, recreate an ideal speech situation where they would debate through what to do, which might mean we'll try to make it 2 days, all four of us alive, but at a certain point we will pre-agree that if a ship hasn't saved us, then we throw someone over and then we work out together in the social contract theory way. How? But note, when you create it that way, you have taken out everything that made these state of nature arguments work. The whole reason you developed state of nature arguments in the 17th century was to say, how would we rethink the entire socio-political and economic world if we could wipe out all existing customs, all existing social hierarchies? What would that ideal world be? They're asking big questions, in other words. Once it's moved to the life raft, the way it works is exactly as Roberto said. You cut out all the big questions, and it's simply a procedural question. What do these four people on the life raft do procedurally to, exactly as Roberto said, be blameless? That's it. You do not, in these exercises, rethink the world. You do not ask, what are the implications of thinking of humans as possessive individuals? Like them or not, but Kant and Rousseau absolutely, for all of their differences, wrestled with the implications of that question. That's ruled out. How do you organize the world? Well, that's not a condition. It's who's going to live on this life raft. So you take out all of the grand questions about how we live our lives, how we define the humans, how we define the cosmos, what kind of a social world we're trying to create. All of that is wiped out, and moral philosophy simply becomes this procedural set of moves within a predetermined artificial situation that prevents you from asking the big questions. And let me simply close by noting the next point, again already made much more powerfully by Roberto, so I'll just underline it. In doing so, note part of why I suspect these moves are so popular in American universities, where post-war philosophical forces will deal with exactly this sort of thing. Perhaps one of the reasons this is so popular is because we live in a social world, by which I mean America, in which this is kind of how things work at a larger social level too, right? So not that we will write 3 volumes working out the philosophical connection between these 3 positions, but de facto we live in a world where they are brought together simply as procedural points. And what I mean by that is the following. We take for granted that we are possessive individuals battling amongst each other for limited resources. We take for granted that that means there's a marketplace in which those of us who work harder will get more of those resources, and we take for granted there should be basic rules governing that marketplace. Those rules are going to be either based in limited democratic decision-making, or much more commonly, utilitarian decisions made by experts who are running the economic order. And we live in a world where we like to think we are Kantian self-legislators, deciding our lives for ourselves, in which we live in a rule-based utilitarian order that has worked out the way cost-benefit should operate in the marketplace, and we live in a democratic framework where theoretically we could question that, but note the degree to which all of these are radically delimited. So we do not have a democratic process that is radically, so I'll use Roberto's words, hot. We have one that delimits things largely to procedural matters, and then you have debates as to whether tax rate should be 31% or 34%, but you radically delimit what is a topic of possible debate. In terms of the marketplace, we still tend to think that marketplaces are natural, so the fact that, in fact, this is it is states deciding how to define the marketplace is largely something that isn't debated because we kind of think that's natural. And in terms of our self-legislating, well, the self-legislating comes down to things like what we choose to wear and what Google sites we choose to visit. So it's a radical delimitation of what all of this would mean, or putting it in stronger terms, We live in a world created by these early modern visions of possessive individuals, but unlike them, they were making arguments, we take it for granted and we don't ask the big questions anymore because we live in a world not unlike the life raft example. We live in a world where everything has been redefined or tightened down to relatively minor procedural questions that take out the larger questions of how should we be living our lives.
But I think one, before we open up, one enigma remains, which is what should be our attitude to philosophy? Because after all, our argument here is a philosophical argument. The subject matter of the course are the prophetic orientations that arise in humanity. But what we're doing is philosophizing about this stuff. And what's the conception of philosophy? So we can't accept anymore the old idea, the classical idea of philosophy as a super science, because that presupposes that outside the particular disciplines, there's a higher level, and that we can look down on the specialties and pronounce judgments from this higher level. We don't believe that. We find it impossible to believe that. On the other hand, the other conception of philosophy, the shrunken conception of philosophy as a thought police, is also unsatisfactory. So what has to be our conception? Our conception has to be that philosophy is the exercise of the reserve powers of the mind. It's like the mind at war, insisting on its prerogative to deal with the things that matter most by going up to the limit of what's sayable and thinkable as far as we can, and trying to think beyond the restraints of the specialized disciplines without claiming this higher insight. And that's the paradoxical position with which we're left. Now maybe we should open up.
Yes,
to all of
indeed.
you.
Open this up. Please, yes.
Can you please clarify the difference between the speculative monism and the temporal naturalism? And the kind of thing that confused me a little is that you put the Semitic religions under temporal naturalism, which I would
They
think
should
would
be, because their philosophers haven't been. That is, the major philosopher, Christian philosopher, was Aquinas. And behind Aquinas, Aristotle. So, Averroes in the Muslim tradition, Maimonides in Judaism, and Aquinas in Christianity. The master was Aristotle, the Greek philosophy being. And you could say, well, that's already heretical, because why is it that a religion like Christianity is going to be filtered through the categories of the Greek philosophy of being? Is that not counter to the whole thrust of Christianity? So, now you ask, what's the relation to speculative monism?
Yeah, because I would think that like the whole idea of there are things that are changing, but those don't go to bedrock, and then the idea of God is that that's the bedrock. So I would think
Because
that
in speculative monism, the notion is the distinctions among things or the changes among things are either unreal, they're illusory, or they're epiphenomenal. They don't cut to the root, to the bottom. And because there's something else that's the real thing. The real thing in speculative monism is the timeless one. The position in temporal naturalism is nothing is less real because it's temporal. The distinction, the ephemeral distinctions among things are all there is. There's nothing else. There's no ultimate reality to which we can contrast what's real. That's the fundamental contrast. And of course, it would help to explain that, to say, take the methodological and epistemological example of natural history. Because in natural history, that's precisely the situation. We have this idea that the natural kinds, the types like the species in animal evolution, are all mutable. There are no eternal types, they all change. There's path dependence. There isn't one master causal narrative. There are a set of loosely connecting causal sequences. And we believe in the third proposition, which is the coevolution of the laws and of the phenomena. The regularities that govern, for example, sexual reproduction, emerge together with the phenomenon that they describe. So it's not that this is mysterious. We're familiar with this idea in the context of natural history. But here we would generalize it to all of nature, to the universe. We'd say, cosmology is the master science. And in cosmology, history trumps structure. It's not that structure is subordinate, history is subordinate to structure, it's the opposite. Structure is subordinate to history. The structures are all temporary that arise. That is, the universe, for example, has a moment in which it has a relatively stable crystallized structure, which is then described by the laws, symmetries, and constants of nature. And then it has the fiery moments in which the structure melts down. So that's a way of treating it not as a peculiarity of a superficial level of nature, but as the true character of nature altogether.
Please, yes.
I was really interested by your point about how the sort of moral theory incorporates the idea of Christianity, placing the individual kind of on that level with God.
It's
And-
not just moral theory, right? Because Christian theology, almost from the outset, has been taken in by this idea. So if you ask me, I would say, what's essential to Christianity? I would say two things. The idea of infinity, first of all, that the individual is the infinite, and that he participates in the character of divinity. And the infinite is the essential element of our experience. So everything in our experience points beyond itself. That's every aspect of human experience is engaged in this dialectic of finitude and transcendence. That's the first thing, the infinite. And the second thing that's essential to Christianity is the primacy of love. Love rather than altruism. And then it seems to me that the deepest question of Christian theology is the relation of these two themes. What's the relation of the primacy of love as the organizing principle of our moral experience with the infinite, with our participation in the infinite?
Yeah, so I think that my question is kind of related to how all the three sort of moral theories that we're talking about in particular kind of try to create this condition of absolute equality among people.
And it's paradoxical, right? That in all of these religions, the religions of the Bible, the prophetic vision is filtered through this anti-historical, anti-temporal view, which we then explicate through the categories of Greek philosophy, of the Greek philosophy being. So this is the God of the philosophers, not the God of the prophets.
You somewhat kind of answered my question, but my question was kind of what to make of the idea that they're creating conditions of absolute equality, that they're kind of presuming equality to be a good thing on its own, and sort of the desirable starting point from which we can work out how we want the rest of the world order to flow from. Where that assumption kind of came from, it seems like you're suggesting it came from like the real sort of actualization of Christianity and like sort of like primal love and
Yes, so remember in the first class I proposed this idea that all of these world religions were the result of a series of revolutions, mischaracterizing the concept of the axial age. And one of the common characteristics of all of these world religions is they deny that the divisions within humanity are fundamental. They all assert in one way or another that the divisions are shallow and superficial. But there's an ambiguity in the way in which they relate this. Are they proposing a way to redescribe reality, or are they proposing an invitation to transform reality? And that applies to all of the characteristics of these religions that we examine, right? Is it a ticket to escape the world, or is it an invitation to change the world? That's what's not clear in the historical evolution of these religions.
Thank you.
Just to underline these points, let me mention, so indeed, so the way this is going to work out in Christianity, in, as we will see, various ways, will be the claim that each individual is a little god, and the claim is ideally equally so, and the hierarchy would ensue from the degree to which
This is the 18th and 19th century version of Christianity.
Exactly, exactly. But even with that reading, just to give you a sense of where we're going with the course, so as we mentioned, that early modern version, in which you get social contract theory, Kantianism, and in a very different way utilitarianism under Bentham, all of that are building on these two themes we're mentioning from Christianity, sort of making individuals into little deities, and defining their interrelationship largely in terms of altruism and compassion. So if every individual is a little deity, the danger, as Roberto has said, is they will be selfish, narcissistic. So how do you get them to relate to each other? And all of the theories, for all of the radical differences in their early development, despite Parvin's argument, are all about how do you get these little gods to relate together.
Well, apply this to the United States, right? So, for example, Harold Bloom is known for the thesis of what he called the American religion. So the thesis is in the United States, coming from the 18th and 19th century, there were three currents of Christianity. There's the established Protestantism and Catholicism. There's the secular humanism, which is to a large extent a secularization of the Christian vision, the Christian ethic. And there's what Harold Bloom called the American religion, by which he meant the religions that the Americans invented themselves, like Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Southern Baptists, and so forth. Now, what you could say is that what Bloom is what Bloom is calling the American religion has a central idea: the individual is God. He participates directly in the life of God. But this version of Christianity is subject to two heresies, is marked by two heresies. They are two heretical departures from Christianity, I would argue. One is a disturbance in the imagination of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. So according to the American heresy, the individual becomes strong, becomes prosperous, and as a result of his strength and prosperity, he then is able to be generous. In other words, solidarity comes after self-construction. The heresy is the belief that there's a separation between self-construction and solidarity. The denial of solidarity is a moment in self-construction, not a result of the strength that results from self-construction. And the second heresy, the second Christian heresy, which in the categories of patristic early church theology we would call Pelagianism, is the idea that the United States, early in its history, close to the time of its foundation, discovered the definitive formula of a free society. And all the other countries in the world must either subscribe to this formula or continue to vegetate in poverty and despotism. So, in other words, they have access to the formula of a free society. The formula of a free society is embodied in the Constitution. The Constitution is part of the national identity. And the Americans revere their Constitution and treat it differently from the way in which every other country in the world treats their Constitution. The other countries change their constitutions. The Americans change their Constitution almost only by pretending that it means something different from what it was thought to mean before. In other words, they change the Constitution primarily by reinterpreting it rather than by amending it. So, and this is then the instrument of these two heresies of Christianity in the United States. Yes?
So the way you describe Harold Bloom talks about it as anxiety of influence. And so,
Speak louder.
so the thing that you describe, Harold Bloom talks about it as the anxiety of influence, where every new writer, artist simply reinterprets somebody who he was influenced from.
Are you putting your microphone on?
I'm pressing it, I don't know if it's working.
Okay.
This one? So Harold Bloom talks about the same thing as the anxiety of influence, in which almost all novel breakthroughs or interpretations are radical departures, at the same time reinterpretations of what went on before. But coming back to how you started the lecture, first thing is in terms of logic, the categories of secondness and firstness are mutually codependent. By that what I mean is time itself does not come into being before creation. So time is just another way of trying to draw a relationship between two different distributions of probabilities. And the same will hold true in the natural sciences or in physics. And the same will hold true if we try to think of history and other disciplines. And then I think I would like to hear more from both of you about the two meanings of cosmology, one in physics and the other in anthropology, and how therein we speak about something like mutuality of being, the being not being contained.
What do you mean by its meaning in anthropology?
Cosmology's meaning in anthropology.
Yeah.
Different cultures have.
Oh, you mean worldviews
Same thing.
among different cultures?
Yeah, it's the same thing, relexifying. We can continue with the practice of relexifying it differently. And also I think another distinction is that the social sciences are trying to come up with a settled social, whereas the fundamental thing that happens is reconstitution of the social in the social sciences. And the same thing happens in natural sciences as well. It's reconstitution instead of settling what is out there in the nature or settling what is out there in the social. And in sense, this goes back to the first lecture. Every time this possibility of reconstitution is taken away, any radical idea becomes domesticated.
I didn't follow all of that.
Sure, yep. So let me answer it, also pick up the previous question too, and deal with them both together if it's okay. So in both cases, sort of a point toward where we'll be going. So if the discussion today has been this attempt in early modern Europe to redefine earlier Christian positions in this particular way, a way that's become very influential for the world we're living in, note, it is one possible way of rereading the Christian tradition. In this case, of course, as we've noted, it is taking a vision of a God, moving it to possessive individuals who are defined as little gods, and then moving the notion of universal love and reducing that again to ways they interact. Now, as Roberto has mentioned, this is one of many possible readings. So beginning next week, we will go back to some of these early Christian writings try to read them in all of their power, where they develop these notions of divine infinity and love, again, very radical notions of love. And then we will also trace other attempts to build out visions of a radical divinization of the human that we will see in figures like Emerson, Nietzsche, etc. None of these will be perfect, but it certainly gives you a different way of thinking about this. We will also talk about the possibilities, not fully played out, of notions of love, played out much more fully in a reconstituted form. And then a little bit later in the course, we'll of course dramatically attempt that reconstitution to say, how would we give that stronger reading? Now, I mentioned this in relationship to both questions to say, of course, all of these are rereadings of the Christian tradition. However, it is also the case that this notion of a radical equality of all human beings comes up in this period, this crucial period that we'll constantly be looking back to. The Christian attempt is one cosmological attempt to do so. We will also, of course, be looking at the South Asian attempts, which are equally committed to the notion of access of all human beings to divinity. However, divinity is going to be radically rethought to the point where that's not even necessarily the best term to be used. As we will see, will the entire notion of humanity, and we'll have a radically different vision working that out. And we will, again, look at rereadings of that, particularly with figures like Schopenhauer. And then, of course, we will then turn to the further part of Eurasia on the eastern side, where, again, you will get this strong commitment to the claim coming from the Confucian tradition that all of us are equal in the sense that we're all equally messes at birth, and what we become depends on the worlds we construct, and we will see how that develops, and again, what it would mean to reconstruct that vision. So think of today's session as one rereading of these Christian notions, highly influential, but potentially problematic in ways that we're at least beginning to explore. And we will look at, over the rest of the course, other ways in which these notions of radical equality were developed, the implications of the ways they have been read, successfully or not, and then how we would reconstitute them, all of which will indeed be wrestling with all of these key questions. How do we think about notions of the human, notions of cosmology, notions of divinity? And we will see each one of those three terms will be significantly questioned as we go through the exercise. Oh, yes, please. Thank you for the points, yes.
Oh, my bad. Can you hear me?
Feel free to scream if we don't see.
Oh, you're good. So can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Nice. All right. So I wanted to just quickly ask about the earlier characterization of the standard model as sort of, less time down than cosmology. I guess to my mind, I've always thought of the standard model as quite time down, right? Like the particle proceeding backwards through time. So particles have such short time spans that you know to identify them fairly okay. And then of course there's the ever ratcheting of entropy, right? Which just means like it's just like allows us to basically infer that this can go on forever. I guess my question is, given sort of the role of time within the standard model, how did it, separately from cosmology, sort of able to divorce itself from time and say the popular parlance?
I don't hear half of it.
Oh, yeah, so I'll
It's better to shout than to use the microphone.
Yeah, it might indeed be better to shout. I will repeat it for the class. So the question was about the standard model, and the question in science, and the question was, well, isn't there a notion of temporality built in with the fact that you have entropy, you have particles shifting, et cetera? And I think the answer, correct me if I'm mistaken, would be yes, but the laws are seen as non-temporal, right? And so the argument is that we can work out a set of atemporal laws that will govern change. And change happens within those laws that we can work out as a systematic structure. And the concern would be, in fact, that seems to be
And that's
wrong.
intimately related
Exactly.
to the question of mathematics and modern
Yes.
science.
Yes.
Because mathematics offers physics a poison chalice, which is the idea of timeless laws. That derives from the sovereignty of mathematics
Yes.
in physics.
Exactly. Oh, yes, please, please. Of course, of course.
If I can offer a kind of provocation.
Please.
So, Roberto, at the end of your lecture, you ended with a question about the enigma of philosophy.
Yes.
And I think it was something like this exercise of the reserve of the mind.
So the mind has reserve powers.
Correct.
Which are not exhausted by the specialized disciplines. And the wedge or the opportunity for the exercise of those powers is twofold. First is that there is a contingent element in the relation between methods and subject matters. So the principle of the university culture is the forced marriage of method and subject matter. For example, economics is not the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method developed at the end of the 19th century, the marginalist method. And any study of mathematics by some other method is not considered economics. So that's an opportunity for this reserve power. The second is that every elaborate empirical theory presupposes an ontology, a view of the kinds of things that there are. So it's like a philosophy within the science. And these are the two wedges through which we drive philosophy into science.
So the provocation that I would have is, for someone like Wittgenstein, philosophy is itself the kind of sickness that is the root. It's a kind of like disease that is causing us to sort of keep trying to seek further and further concepts beneath other concepts. So it's not just a kind of, the problem isn't just the use of philosophy, but it's kind of philosophy itself as a sickness, right? And so I would point to someone like Parfit, for whom these concepts of truth and benefit and good are constantly kind of flowing into each other, partly because they're empty, and partly because they're not telling us more about each other. They're actually telling us something about philosophy, right?
But of course, I can't share that view, because for me, philosophy is not the sickness. Philosophy is the salvation in the realm of the mind, because it's the assertion in the realm of the mind of the sovereignty of our imaginative power, that we can imagine more than is rendered explicit in the established organization of knowledge. And were it not that, we would be smaller and less godlike than we are. So it's the opposite of the Wittgensteinian view.
Thanks.
Yes, please.
What do you think was the consequence of creating a modernity and filling it with radical opposition to what it made pre-modern, and basically exciting concepts like divinity, exciting concepts like the possibility of divinizing the self? And how do you think it led to a narrowing tunnel of what kind of life can be imagined?
I don't know how I'm going to deal with this problem of actually hearing what's said. I don't hear it.
Oh, so yeah, let me. So the question, since you couldn't hear it, the question was, what do we think about the concept of modernity and the degree to which it predefines how we understand the past and what we see
But
as
I
a
don't know,
possible
who
vision?
cares about the concept of modernity? It's a prejudice, right?
Yes.
It doesn't, what does modernity mean? Does it mean the recent past? So the first thing I would do with that concept is to attack it.
And let me just underline that. I would say, as a very good beginning for all of us, try not to use the term modernity. And I really mean that. As Roberto has said, the term modernity, which again, we take so for granted, we just assume, yeah, we live in the modern world and that's somehow distinct from the traditional world, but the implications are exactly as the question is pointing. The implication of that is that everything that was ever thought or done in all of human history prior to, whenever you date it, the 19th century in Europe, is somehow traditional and therefore something from which we could not learn. And it also means that this stuff that we're defining as modern, which is almost exclusively Euro-American ideas and practices of the past 2 centuries, are somehow, if not absolutely correct, at least among the only things we can actually think through and think with, because by definition, everything that came before is traditional and surpassed. This is a horrible way to think. This is an absolutely horrible way to think. Humans throughout history have been wrestling with these ideas, as we've noted. There was one extraordinary period in human history when prophecy and the sort of gates were thrown open. They've sadly been closed, but that is always available to us. And the concept of modernity that closes that world off is absolutely horrific. So, have lots of things happen in the past 2 centuries? Of course, industrialism, capitalism, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The idea that we should call all of these modern and therefore relegate everything else to the non-modern world is incredibly dangerous. So I agree. Let's just get rid of the concept altogether. I don't mean to imply that's going to be easy, but it is absolutely worth doing.
But a question that we have that emerges from this conversation and that Steve just put is, what should be our attitude to these disciplines and intellectual traditions? So a claim that arises from this argument is that cosmology is a historical science. And it's the master science. It's not large-scale astronomy. It's the science of everything. And the world that it describes must be the whole world, every part of nature. And we can't treat it as if it were an aside. And those things matter. So that's a lead into a philosophical argument about the meaning of modern science, as is this recombination of methods and subject matter. So we treat evolutionary biology, macrobiology, by a historical method, and we treat fundamental physics as non-historical. But that's just contingent, right? There's no justification for that. The fundamental science is historical, and it is the basic science. And the national curriculums in the world, most countries have a national curriculum. The United States basically doesn't, but almost every other country does. What the national curriculums do is that they are infantilizations of the hegemonic theories in science. They're the translation of the dominant ideas, like that physics is unhistorical, into the teaching of the young. And they induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are. So one of the things that we should desire is to make basic education, primary education, more profound than university education. Because as a result of the way in which they're now educated, the young are emasculated and delivered to the universities prepared for a life of intellectual servility. And our objective should be to use their education to immunize them against this emasculation and prepare them then for intellectual resistance so that they can't be fooled by what they'll hear in the universities. And that would create a completely different situation.
Yes. And that is a perfect place to end today's discussion. So beginning next week, we will turn to these ideas of infinity and love as they were developed in the Christian tradition. We've talked about one way of reading them today, and needless to say, next week we will talk about very different ways of reading them and the very grand possibilities that could emerge from doing so. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Of course, absolutely.
So, if fair to say that individualism originally liberated people from the domination of structures that prevented their self-actualization, but
That's
what,
the power.
yeah, what we're seeing now is an extreme form of individualism that creates these mini gods that attempt to